Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I can never really tell what the intro is going to look like because if you Google my name, it's some not nice things that'll come up, which, we know how that is with our president. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. Well, thank you so much for having me. I think it's been a great event so far. It's great to be in Iowa. Last time I was in Iowa was actually for the Republican primary back in 2016. February 1st, 2016 was the Republican primary here in 2016. So it's been a little while. So for tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about legal immigration. This is an immigration panel, and it's been a great event so far. We've heard from the Angel Moms. We've heard from some candidates. We've heard a lot about illegal immigration, which to me is, of course, a problem. I think we can all agree illegal immigration is an egregious and unacceptable problem in the country. By its very nature, the people that are here don't belong. The job of the government is to protect the people and keep undocumented people that we can't keep track of out of the country. But I think that's only half of the problem. I think the other half that we have to look at is the legal part of the mass immigration crisis. But before we dive into that, just a little bit about me, like my introduction said. My name is Nick Fuentes. I've actually been involved in a little bit of a battle within the conservative movement against the conservative establishment, which, if you guys are Trump supporters, I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that for the past 25 years, roughly speaking, we haven't just been fighting the left, right? We haven't just been fighting Democrats. I think everybody realizes if you're in the Tea Party, if you supported Trump in 2016, some of the fiercest opposition we got wasn't from the Democrats even, it was from people within our own party. It was from the rhinos, Republicans in name only, establishment types. And so I've been facing a lot of similar things because I have been speaking out along with a lot of other young people against the sort of legal immigration scam. And that's what my talk is going to be about tonight. We're going to look at how mass immigration affects us politically, economically, and culturally. We talk a lot about politics and economics. The cultural aspect is really important. So we're going to get into all of that. Before we do, though, I just want to say my speech tonight is not going to be very politically correct. A little controversial. You might hear some things you disagree with, but of course, that's okay. I hope you'll keep an open mind. I like to think of myself as inspired by Patrick Buchanan. I don't know how many of you guys are fans of Patrick Buchanan. I like to think that we're sort of carrying the torch for him in America First in 2019. But so to start, I think it's important to define the situation. So of course, we've got an illegal immigration crisis that it should be the default position of Republicans that you want to send every single illegal immigrant back over the border. And you should want to build a wall, secure the border, fully fund the $25 billion to build the border wall, maintain it, all the rest, obviously. Because you see the crimes that are being committed by illegal immigrants, whether it be the worst crimes like murder, or even small crimes. And it's absolutely unacceptable because, again, the task of the government, the first task of the government, is to protect its people, to protect the nation. And so people are coming in and they're committing crimes. If that happens one time, that is a terrible tragedy. But again, that is only one part of the equation. What has gone on concurrently with mass illegal immigration is mass legal immigration. And I have to say, as a conservative, I found it a little bit problematic. We've come a long way on the issue of illegal immigration. It was a great day to see Donald Trump become the nominee in 2016 for the Republican Party, where we went from people like John McCain and Mitt Romney who wanted an amnesty, right? And Rubio and a number of others in the Republican primary who wanted to give a pathway to citizenship for millions of illegal immigrants, to a president who's finally going to stand up for the country and say we need a secure border. So I thought that was a great day. But I'll say that it's also not sufficient. I think we have to build upon our victory and move a little bit further on immigration. I'll tell you what I'm talking about. So while we do have something like, they've been saying 11 million illegal immigrants in the country for years. It's probably something like 20 million. We don't really know. That's the very nature of the problem, is we have no idea how many illegals in the country. We do know how many legal immigrants have come in since the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, Immigration Act, was passed almost 50 years ago. Since the Hart-Celler Act in 1965, 59 million legal immigrants have come into the country. And a little bit about the composition of that: 47%
of those immigrants are Hispanic, 26% are Asian, and a good percentage of those are Black. Virtually a very small percentage of the legal immigration in the last 50 years has been from Europe. Virtually all of it has been Hispanic, Asian, and Black. And there's a very important reason for this. And I'll get into it a little bit here when we talk about the political situation. So the last speaker did a very good job explaining where we're headed if we don't get out and vote in Iowa. If you don't get out and campaign, I campaigned for Donald Trump in 2016, actually, in Manchester, New Hampshire. And of course, we do face sort of an existential threat in 2020 when you see who's on the other side. You see who's on the other side, and who's it going to be? Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders? And so, every election they say, well, it's either us or it's the end of the world. In this case, it feels like every election, that's what we're looking at, right? I mean, it's either Trump or it's make healthcare illegal, right? What did Julian Castro talk about? Abortions for transgender people? So, I mean, it's unacceptable that the opposition wins in this one. But we have to think bigger picture. We have to think long term. Reason why I'm talking about mass immigration in relation to this is to think about what the future demographics will look like for voting. And we think very simply about what it's going to take to win in 2020. And, if you've been to the website 270 to win, I think a lot of political type people like to try and create the map. What swing states can Trump win? Now, I was doing this in 2016. What's the coalition going to be? Is it going to be Arizona and Michigan and Wisconsin? Is New Hampshire in play, Nevada? But it's much more important to look at who is voting in these states, particularly in how immigration affects that. For example, we know that California used to be a red state. I'm 21 years old. I don't remember that time. It's not, doesn't register for me. Ronald Reagan carried the state of California 4 times when he was president and including when he was governor. Richard Nixon carried California 6 times. California was a deep red state. And what changed in the last 25 years? It was mass immigration. Now, of course, a lot of that was illegal. A good deal of it was legal too. We know that the future of California was decided by its demographics. Its demographics was its destiny. There was a great article recently in the LA Times. I don't know if you saw this, but it talked about, this was a few weeks ago, it talked about how Texas is going to go the same way of California. Because the same demographic trends that made California a deep red state, turned it purple, and then a deep blue state, are going to do the same thing to Texas. What we see today is an unshakable Republican stronghold. It will become purple and then blue. Just take a look at the last election in 2016. Take a look at the proportion of the vote that Beto O'Rourke drew because he had a fake Hispanic last name, right? Or fake Hispanic first name, I should say. In that article, they talked about breaking down how the different racial demographics are voting in California. Exactly showing mathematically how we got from a red California to a reliably deep blue California. If you break it down by race, you'll find that only 15% of Hispanics are registered Republicans in the state of California. 15%. According to Pew Research, 1 in 10 legal Hispanic immigrants register Republican. 1 in 20 illegal immigrants identify as Republican. They don't register, but that's how they identify. If you look at Asians, only 18% of Asians are registered Republicans in California. If you look at Blacks, 72% of Blacks are registered Democrats. In the last election, this is not just California, this is not just likely voting or predictive polling. In the last election, exit polls showed that Blacks voted 91% for Democrats. So we can see that there's a very close, you could say almost a 1-to-1 relationship between the racial demographics and the political electoral outcome. We see how if you bring in 59 million immigrants in 50 years from virtually all non-white countries, and they come into states like Texas and Arizona and Georgia and Florida, it doesn't take a big imagination to figure out what's going to happen next. And every state from the Southwest to the Southeast to the Northwest will begin to fall blue, and that is a result of demographic change. And it's interesting because a lot of people will frame this election, I hear this a lot from the conservative right, which I think is a mistake, as it's socialism versus capitalism. And I'll tell you why I think that's probably an improper frame. The focus to me is immigration and demographic change. If you don't oppose legal immigration and demographic change, what do you think you get ultimately when all these states turn blue? When Texas turns blue, Florida, Georgia, and they're all drifting that way, what is the inevitable outcome?
Socialism.
Well, exactly right. The country goes Democratic, it becomes nearly impossible for Republicans to be competitive in national elections, and the end result is socialism. So the way that I see it, you cannot oppose legal immigration and oppose socialism, and you get socialism. Or you can oppose legal immigration and socialism, and probably you've got the best chance of staving it off. So I think of politically, the term that I use on my show and the term that I've been hearing is the electoral winter, that there will be a great freezing effect that will set in. Once the demographics become such, after the Democrats have imported a new constituency, because they couldn't win over people in this country, they imported new voters who would obediently and reliantly vote for big government and identity politics and all this. Once that happens, it'll be nearly impossible to reverse. Why would these different groups vote against Democrats when they get all the big government handouts, when they get all the pandering from the left? So I think, to me, the first major consequence of mass legal immigration, this demographic change, is an electoral consequence. So if, the rest of the speech, if that's not resonating with you, you have to think just from a purely partisan perspective that it will be fatal for the Republican Party that this demographic change sets in. The second part is economic, why we should be against legal immigration. What I've heard from across the board, Republican and Democrat, is that legal immigration is a great boon to the economy. This is what we hear from everybody all the time. Illegal immigration, we understand the obvious problems, namely that it's illegal. But when we hear about legal immigration, we hear that so long as the immigrants are qualified, right, or they're getting jobs, or they're not on government assistance, well, they're boosting up the economy. That's what America is all about. It's people coming here and starting businesses. And we're a nation of immigrants and everything. But if you run the numbers, mass legal immigration is toxic. It's fatal for the economy and for the American worker. If you read the book, it's a fantastic book that I recommend to everybody. It's called We Wanted Workers by George Borjas. George Borjas is one of the top immigration economists in the country. He's from Harvard University. He's actually, I believe, a Cuban immigrant himself. So take that for what you will. He broke down all the numbers on immigration economics and how this drastic wave of immigrants has affected the economy. And he found that the long-term fiscal impact for an average immigrant was $119,000. It costs, on average, $119,000 per immigrant from the government. When you look at public housing, when you look at welfare, Medicare, Social Security, the long-term cost, $120,000. So think about it. 59 million immigrants in 50 years at a cost of $120,000 on average per head. The math is mind-boggling. But it doesn't just stop with welfare payments. We all know that that seems to be a problem. We find that immigrant households take welfare at a much higher percentage than native households. But it expands even to the rest of the economy, to the GDP. People say that, well, if immigrants are not taking public assistance, well, they're starting jobs, right? Or they're starting businesses and they're creating jobs. George Borjas found that the short-run surplus of mass immigration, in other words, the economic benefit that accrued to the economy as a result of immigration, was valued at $2 trillion. So the GDP went up by $2 trillion because of mass immigration. He found that out of that $2 trillion, only $50 billion of that GDP short-run surplus accrued to Native Americans. In other words, $2 trillion. So, I think that's a pretty big number. Out of that, virtually all of that money, all of that economic benefit went to the immigrants themselves. In other words, they come here, they start jobs, they start businesses, and on paper, the economy grows. But if you're bringing over more people, and the economy grows commensurate to how many people you're bringing in, is there any real economic growth? Moreover, the $50 billion surplus that accrues to Americans is only one part of the story. There's a very telling line in this book by George Borjas. He said that immigration redistributes wealth from the people who compete with immigrants to the firms that employ immigrants. Think about it like this, right? So the $50 billion surplus is a result of a mathematical equation. All this money accrues to big businesses that employ immigrants. All that money goes to big agriculture. It goes to all the people that are the beneficiary of cheap labor coming across the border. Now that number barely edges out, $50 billion more than the net cost, trillions of dollars that comes at the cost of the American worker. Where do you think that $2 trillion surplus, the $50 billion we get off the top, where do you think that comes from? That comes from the native workers. It's a very simple economic calculation. Immigrants in the labor market are not immune from the laws of supply and demand. If we have so many workers in the country, we bring in a lot more, well, then businesses are willing to pay less for it. Is it any wonder why wages have been stagnant for 25 years? It's because for 25 years and even longer, the spigot of immigration has been just pouring more workers into the labor market. Every chance where maybe the American worker can get back on their feet, where maybe businesses would have to compete for limited American jobs by raising wages, by offering more benefits, more immigrants pour into the country, allowing businesses and firms to take less wages, to offer less wages. More workers, and they get paid less for them. So, to me, the economic picture for immigration is equally as grim. Lastly, and to me this is the most important part, is this. I get asked this a lot from my show and in my battle against the conservative establishment. People say things like, well, of course there are immigrants that vote Republican, right? Just to say that long-term demographic changes are manipulating electoral outcomes doesn't mean that there's no Republican immigrants, right? Or there's no Republican non-white voters. And people say, well, there are immigrants that are contributing to the GDP. There are immigrants that are creating businesses and so on. And so the question is, well, what if every immigrant was coming over and voting Republican? What if every immigrant was coming over and they were starting businesses and they were the model citizen? And I think about it like this. Would it still be America, even if all of those things were true? If the foreign-born population surges, as we've seen in the last 50 years, to record highs, some say it could get as high as 50% in the next century, the foreign-born population, would you say that even if those people are voting Republican, even if they're buying Reeboks and Nikes and they're watching Netflix, even if they're starting businesses and model citizens, would we say that qualitatively it would still be a recognizable country? Would it look the same as it did 50 years ago? No. To me, I think about it like this. A country is only comprised of the people in it. When we say demographics is destiny, what does that mean? Demographics means the people that are comprised in the country. The people are the country. If the constituent parts are different, the whole is different. If we change the Americans living in America, America will be changed. If those changes are significant to the people living in this country, America will be significantly different. And that's not necessarily making a value judgment. Of course, I have my own opinion about it. But it is to say that these demographic changes, which we're being led to believe are innocuous, are harmless, are insignificant, are actually quite drastic and will change the quality and the texture of our lives and the lives of our children and our children's children throughout the generations. Think about it like this. If you're baking a cake or you're baking cookies or following some kind of a recipe, would you say that you would get the same cake or the same cookie if you had different ingredients? If you had baking soda instead of baking powder? Of course not. If you changed up the ingredients to a recipe, you would get a different outcome. You would get a different cake. You would get a different cookie. Why would it be any different for a nation? If the country was comprised of people from the time of the founding who were English settlers and then European immigrants, and now you look at what's happening in the Southwest, and I think you see it's the Hispanization, right? It's turning into Mexico basically in the Southwest. How can you take different people and move them into the country and not get a different country? To me, I think a lot about the fact that in the next 20 to 30 years, white people will become a minority in America. Nobody likes to talk about that. Nobody likes to mention that. People don't like to talk about race. Now, why not? Do you think that that will be a significant or an insignificant change? To me, that's the first question. Will it be something that is a meaningful change when white people go from being a majority to a minority? Will that be inconsequential? Will that be arbitrary? Will that bring trivial differences? Or will it bring differences even at all? Or will there be drastic consequences, drastic changes that we can witness? And then the question becomes, will those changes be good or will they be bad? I live in a suburb of Chicago. I can tell you, I drive into neighborhoods like Little Village and Pilsen, and I can see the demographic changes. I can see what it looks like to be a minority in a place like Pilsen or Chicago. You can travel to Los Angeles or San Francisco. In Los Angeles, the population is 35% white. You can see what it's going to look like. It's like looking into a crystal ball, what the future will be like. And you can see that, number one, the changes brought on by demographic change are real, and they're not inconsequential. And number two, if we really investigate, the differences are not good. And these are tough topics. A lot of people don't like to think like this. A lot of people don't like to think about race. But this is a reality that we're having to deal with as a result of mass demographic change. The mantra that we've been pushed is that diversity is a strength. Bringing in people who speak different languages, believe in different gods, come from different countries, that's supposed to make the country stronger. I simply ask the question, how is that the case? In what situation, in what organization, what hierarchy, whether it be a business or the military or neighborhood or anything like that, if you're simply doing a project in high school, it's a group project, what aids the end goal? What helps in the process by having people that believe in diametrically different things, in many cases are opposed to one another? There's friction, there's cultural differences, different mannerisms, clashing all the time. I ask, what about that makes the country stronger? What helps us do great things like get to Mars, build up the great American economy, build up our infrastructure? I don't see how it happens. And so to me, and I know I'm not sure where the audience is on this question. I know this is, like I said, not very politically correct stuff. But I know that when I look at the situation, I cannot in good conscience support mass immigration, both legal and illegal, when I think about my future children or their children. I can't look around at my suburb in southwest Chicago and in good conscience support a policy that's going to turn it into the south side of Chicago or the west side of Chicago. And to me, I just hope that everybody keeps that in mind. Of course, we are heading into an election year with Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is on the same page with a lot of this stuff. I think he started the conversation about immigration in 2016. For 25 and maybe even longer, 25 years and maybe even longer, the conversation about immigration has been basically the same. There can be no opposition to immigration. There can only be people that prefer a different kind of immigrants. And I'm simply posing questions about whether that's such a good idea at all. But thanks so much. Again, the message we've been trying to push out here, even if people don't agree, that's okay. I think we've left a little bit of time for Q&A, so we'll see if people are interested in that. But of course, the message here tonight has been we are trying to get out there and volunteer for Trump. Of course, illegal immigration will continue. Forget legal immigration. Illegal immigration will continue if we don't get Donald Trump back in office. So thank you so much. Let's make America great.
Are there any people that have questions?
My husband is from France.
Very low percentage.
Yeah.
Very good.
We, just a few years ago, had to go live in France because he got transferred there. And so I, as an American, had to immigrate into France. And it's tough. We've been married over 30 years, and let me tell you, they put you through the mill. They give you a medical exam. They want to make sure that you speak French, just to give me a visa to stay. If we try, if in the U.S., I really believe everybody is better off if they speak English. I think it's wonderful if they speak another language, but they should really speak English. It's the language of business. And so, yet, I'm afraid we go and say, English has to be, we want English to be the official language of the United States. Oh my gosh, we're going to be all racist. Have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, and then that's getting at, I think, fundamentally the idea of cohesion. As a nation, a country, a neighborhood, you want to have cohesion. You want to have things in common with your neighbors. That's natural. And everybody says that if you start to talk about these concentric circles of identity, that we want to have things in common with one another, that makes you racist or exclusionary. I think that's totally right. And it's interesting. They had all kinds of ballot measures throughout the 1990s. English only, you must speak English, English only schools and everything. You can't find a single one where Americans voted against that. But in spite of that, we never see it in laws. And that's because big businesses know that if they made that a requirement, they couldn't import cheap labor because that's coming from Mexico, right? Or it's coming from Asia. So that's a great point.
Yes. With regards to illegal immigration and what you were talking about, the actual cost of social programs and so forth, I think it's Milton Friedman who said it, and maybe he's quoting somebody. If you don't put a wall around your country, then you have to put a wall around your benefits programs. And so how do we get that shift? And secondly, how do we get these people into our society thinking the way Americans always thought before, to understand the value of the American dream, to be contributors and not users?
That's a great question and a great point, too. And that's even libertarians have a tough time with this. Milton Friedman was a libertarian. A lot of libertarians like Justin Amash and others are open borders advocates. They think they want mass movements of goods and mass movements of people. And that's exactly the problem is when you have a welfare state and you're giving out free money, it doesn't really work when you also have an open invite to anybody in the world who wants to come here. It just doesn't make any fiscal sense. So I think that's a great point. I mean, the problem is that the Congress is so controlled by Chamber of Commerce and all the interests that want these people here. I mean, who do you think gives them money for the political campaigns? It's big business that benefits from cheap labor. And the question about assimilation, essentially, how do we assimilate the immigrants here? I'll tell you, there's not any easy answers. What used to be the case 100 years ago is that there was pressure to assimilate. You had to learn English. I'm fourth generation. My ancestors are Italian, Mexican, and Irish. When they came here, they had to learn the language. My mother works in a school, and in a lot of these classrooms, they pander to these kids and they speak Spanish exclusively right up through to middle school. How can you assimilate when there's no dominant culture saying that the language must be English and these are our values and this is the religion? Now you get called a racist or a white supremacist if you say that American culture is this, and it's not Spanish, and it's not whatever other kinds of cultures are coming over here. So I think it's a very difficult question when we're in the middle of a culture war. We don't have a monoculture even for people to assimilate into.
Thank you.
One more question, and then we're going to wrap up for tonight.
Okay.
One thing that I've noticed, I'm a pilot, and if you understand the air traffic control and the pilots all speak English. And the reason they do is you might have airplanes falling out of the sky if you don't understand what people are communicating. But one thing I've never been a big fan of diversity training. I always felt that maybe we should be doing similarity training based upon Maslow's hierarchy of need. And if I look at the Hispanic culture, they're big on family. They tend to be Roman Catholic, which at least they used to be, pro-life. I'm not sure where they are these days. But wouldn't it be smart to take a look at the similarities that we all share, that we want to make sure that we have economic prosperity, that we've got a family culture, that we're safe? The whole Maslow's hierarchy of need. I'll let you answer.
That's a great question. I'll address the first part. I happen to be a quarter Mexican. My father's half Mexican. A lot of people sound like racist for my immigration beliefs. Like racist against who? I'm Mexican, but that was the perception, right? For so long is that Mexicans are these natural conservatives. I think that was the language used by Paul Ryan. That all these immigrants who were supposed to come here, George W. Bush let in 8 million immigrants in 5 years with the intention that they were all supposed to vote Republican, I guess, right? And he was going to ride that to re-election, and I guess Dick Cheney was going to be president after him, and so on. But we found that that's not the case. We found that, all these supposedly pro-family, natural conservative Hispanics, they have never in this century voted more than 35% for a Republican candidate for president. Never more than 35%. Now, they're voting for who? The Democrats are in favor of late-term abortions and homosexuality and transgender rights and everything else. So I think we have to grapple with is the fact that there is significant already balkanization in America. Maybe, like you said, I think there is something to say about back in the day. It used to be different, where the Black community was very traditional, very Christian, very family-oriented. Hispanics were the same way. But this new generation that we're getting, specifically from immigrants, is militant. We know that they're being radicalized by the media, by the university system, with a lot of this cultural Marxist kind of stuff, that now you look at a lot of these communities, and almost all these young people have a chip on their shoulder against the historic American nation. You know, they say that what the founding fathers were slave owners. And Christopher Columbus Day was just a couple months ago, and we can't celebrate that because he was, genocidal and so on. So I absolutely agree. We should try and focus on what the differences are, but I think unless and until we shut down the immigration and acknowledge that there is an American monoculture, because that's the question, is you look at the Democrats, they don't even agree on these fundamental things. The Democrats are not a Christian party. They don't speak English. They don't believe in European culture, European values, or white American values, anything like that. They have people like Sadiq Khan and all these characters Tisra Khan at the last Democratic National Convention. So I would say that the task first is to shut down the immigration, people pouring in that have no chance of assimilating, and then we have to establish a monoculture for people to assimilate into. But until we do those two things, I think it's honestly a folly. All right, well, thank you so much.
Once again, I want to thank all our wonderful speakers for traveling to the Quad Cities.